This is Houston, a city known for its oil industry, its major sports, and of course NASA. Sitting in the southern portion of the United States, it has become one of the most recognized cities in America. But hidden in plain sight is something strange. When you look at Houston from a distance, the skyline feels incomplete. Instead of one continuous cluster of tall buildings, the city is broken into pieces. There's a skyline in downtown, one in Uptown, and others all across the area, each separated by miles of low-rise development. So how did this happen? In this video, we're going to explain the unusual reason Houston has such a complicated skyline and the choices that led to it. We'll also explore parts of the city's planning to better understand how Houston ended up this way, and what it can still show us today. But first, we need to go back to where it all started. Long before Houston became the city we see today, it existed only as an idea on paper. In 1836, the land along Buffalo Bayou was flat coastal prairie, covered in heavy clay soil that turned into thick mud whenever it rained. The site sat far inland from the Gulf of Mexico and lacked a deep harbor or any natural advantage. It was difficult land to build on, but it was also wide open, cheap, and easy to claim. That same year, Augustus and John Allen purchased the land and founded Houston as a speculative town. They did not solve the land's problems. Instead, they sold a vision. Through maps and newspaper ads, Houston was presented as a future commercial center long before it truly functioned as one. To make that vision feel real, the Allen brothers laid out a wide street grid along the bayou. The streets were unusually broad for the time because wide streets made lots easier to sell. The grid followed the curve of the water rather than true north, creating the angled downtown layout that still exists today. That decision worked on paper. In real life, it quickly became a problem. As the settlement grew in the late 19th century, daily life exposed the limits of that early plan. The wide streets sat directly on clay soil. After even moderate rain, they turned into deep mud pits. Wagons sank. Travel slowed. Entire sections of town became impassable. Houston earned a reputation as a mud city. To keep commerce moving, the city began paving major streets with vitrified brick during the 1890s. Still, those improvements were uneven. In Freedmanstown, where the city refused to invest, residents took matters into their own hands. They raised money, laid bricks themselves, and created patterned streets that remain visible today. Even as streets improved, Houston faced a larger economic problem. Galveston controlled deep water access, while Houston relied on shallow barges to move goods downstream. That balance held until 1900, when a powerful hurricane devastated Galveston. The disaster exposed the risk of coastal ports and forced the region to reconsider where trade should flow. Houston did not wait for conditions to change. It redesigned them. City leaders partnered with the federal government to dredge a deep water channel from Buffalo Bayou to the Gulf. When the Houston Ship Channel opened in 1914, the city's growth reorganized itself. Heavy industry lined the channel to the east. Wealth and residential development moved west. With oil discoveries and port traffic bringing money into the city, Houston began building upward. Downtown towers replaced church steeples, signaling a shift toward a modern skyline. But questions about how land should be organized remained unsolved. While the city debated zoning laws in 1929, developers had already found another solution. In the early 1920s, figures like Will Hogg used private deed restrictions to tightly control development in places like River Oaks. When zoning failed again in 1948, those private rules became the only form of land control, shaping a city with strict order in some areas and almost none in others. After World War II, Houston entered a new phase. Air conditioning conquered the climate. In 1947, Foley's department store opened as a sealed, windowless building cooled entirely by machines, proving dense indoor space no longer depended on heat or airflow. But while air conditioning changed buildings, the car changed distance. In 1949, the Shamrock Hotel opened miles from downtown, pulling activity away from the center. Mayor Oscar Holcomb responded by annexing surrounding land and expanding freeway connections to tie everything together. By the mid-1950s, Houston had clearly become a city that grew outward. Over time, it also grew upward. forming the tall buildings we recognize today. Yet, when you look at Houston now, something feels different. Those towers do not form one continuous skyline. Instead, they appear in separate clusters across the city. So why is that? So, by the mid-1950s, Houston had clearly become a city that grew outward. Over the decades that follow, it also grew upward, adding the tall buildings and modern skyscrapers we recognize today. Yet, when you look at Houston now, something feels different. Those towers do not form one continuous skyline. Instead, they appear in several separate clusters across the city. So why is that? To understand it, you first have to see what those skylines actually are. Downtown remains the historic and legal center, where courts, banks, and energy headquarters concentrate in the densest cluster of towers. West of downtown, the Galleria area grew into a second skyline shaped around detail, hotels, and finance, anchored by highway access rather than a civic core. South of downtown, the Texas Medical Center expanded into a vertical landscape of hospitals and research towers that rivals the downtowns of entire cities. Farther west, the energy corridor formed as a stretched skyline along the freeway, defined by corporate campuses and parking rather than streets. In between, places like Greenway Plaza emerged as privately planned business hubs that functioned like small cities of their own. Each of these skylines did not emerge to fix a citywide problem. They formed to capture opportunity. Downtown was expensive, congested, and increasingly difficult to build in. West Houston offered cheaper land, direct highway access, and far fewer constraints. Developers realized they no longer needed the historic center to build tall. If land could be assembled and cars could reach it easily, a skyline could form almost anywhere. That leads to the first major reason Houston has so many skylines. The city never locked tall buildings into a single central business district. In most large American cities, zoning laws decide where density belongs. Houston never adopted that system. Without use-based zoning, developers were free to build upward wherever conditions made financial sense. Over time, it became easier to start new business districts rather than to compete for space downtown. Capital followed the path of least resistance, and new skylines followed capital. The second reason is the freeway system. Houston did not grow up around rail lines or walkable grids. It grew around loops and interchanges. Loop 610, Beltway 8, and major highways turned distant intersections into places with regional access comparable to downtown. A site near a freeway could compete simply because it was easier to reach by car. Once highways replaced streets as the organizing structure, towers no longer needed to cluster in one place. They could rise wherever traffic converged. The third reason comes down to developers and executive commutes. From the 1960s onward, many business leaders lived on the west side of the city. Long drives downtown became less appealing. Developers responded by building offices closer to where decision-makers lived. Projects like Uptown and Greenway Plaza were assembled as complete environments, with offices, parking, hotels, and retail designed together. They operated as standalone centers instead of feeding the historic core. Taken together, these forces turned Houston into a polycentric city. Downtown remained the economic heavyweight, but it no longer held a monopoly on growth. Power and development spread across the region. For developers, this arrangement was incredibly flexible. For the city itself, the downsides became harder to ignore. With destinations scattered across miles of highway, daily life shifted almost entirely to cars. Distances grew. Walking became impractical. Transit became difficult to design. Congestion spread everywhere instead of concentrating in one place. Houston did not just end up with many skylines. It ended up with a city built around driving between them. And that brings up a different problem altogether: walkability. The answer becomes clear the moment you try to move through Houston on foot. In many parts of the city, sidewalks simply do not exist. A person can be walking on a clean, well-built path that suddenly ends in grass, a ditch, or a busy roadway with no safe crossing. This is not unusual. It's the result of how the city chose to build. For decades, Houston allowed property owners to avoid constructing sidewalks by paying a small fee instead. On its own, that choice made sense for any single owner. Paying the fee was cheaper than pouring concrete. But when everyone made the same decision, the outcome changed. The city ended up with a sidewalk network full of gaps, where pieces existed but rarely connected. What saved money for individuals slowly undermined walkability for everyone. As Houston continued spreading outward, that pattern repeated at a larger scale. Homes, offices, and stores were built farther apart. Buildings were pushed back behind parking lots. Streets were designed for speed, not for people crossing on foot. Outside of a few historic pockets like Montrose or Midtown, living without a car became nearly impossible. Over time, driving stopped being a preference and became a requirement. Parking rules reinforced this shift. Businesses were required to build large numbers of parking spaces whether they needed them or not. Entire blocks turned into asphalt. In residential areas, apartment buildings wrapped themselves around parking garages, creating long blank walls at street level. Daily life followed the same logic. Jobs were scattered across districts. Stores were separated from homes. Schools were placed along fast roads. Most trips now required a car. By 2025, the average Houston resident spent more than an hour a day driving. Traffic became the top concern across the region. Many people began to consider leaving, not because of work or weather, but to escape the commute. This design also carried a human cost. Houston's streets are wide, straight, and fast, which increases the risk of severe crashes. Traffic deaths reached record highs, with pedestrians making up a growing share of victims. Many of these deaths occurred on roads that look like highways but function as city streets. Children were not spared. Driving became the leading cause of death for young kids in the county. These outcomes were shaped by earlier decisions. In the early 1990s, Houston had a funded plan to build a monorail linking major job centers. That plan was canceled, shutting the door on a rapid transit alternative just as the city's sprawl was accelerating. Later rail efforts were limited by compromise, resulting in slow lines that shared space with cars and failed to reach key districts. Each delay pushed the city deeper into car dependence. And this problem did not stay contained. As Houston kept expanding outward, these issues multiplied. Which leads to the next question. If car dependence and poor walkability are symptoms, then what role did endless outward growth play in creating them? To answer that, you have to look at how Houston kept spreading and why it never stopped. Houston's outward growth was not random. It was built into the system. Over time, the city expanded farther than almost any other in the country, covering hundreds of square miles and pushing development deeper into open land. Distance stopped being a barrier. It became normal. One reason Houston kept spreading comes down to how new neighborhoods were financed. Instead of the city extending roads and pipes itself, developers could form special districts that borrowed money to build infrastructure up front, with the cost passed on to future homeowners through added taxes. For developers, this removed a major limit. It became easy to build far from the city center without facing immediate consequences. Subdivisions appeared first. Connections followed later. Highways acted as a turbocharger for this process. Each new loop opened fresh land and made it easier to reach, which encouraged developers to build even farther out. That new development then created demand for yet another loop. Over time, the city grew so wide that crossing it could take hours. Driving became a daily requirement rather than a choice. Traffic did not stay in one place. It spread across the entire region. As Houston expanded, it also replaced much of its natural landscape. Wetlands and prairie were paved to make room for roads and housing. These areas once acted like a sponge, absorbing enormous amounts of rainwater. When that sponge disappeared, the city lost its ability to absorb storms. Flooding did not begin because of this change, but it became more frequent and more severe. There was also a cost beneath the surface. To serve distant growth, groundwater was pumped heavily for decades. The clay soil compressed. Parts of the region began to sink. Roads cracked. Pipes failed. Fixing them grew more expensive each year. At the same time, something quieter began happening closer to the center. The same lack of regulation that allowed the city to sprawl outward also allowed it to change inward. Adjustments to local rules made smaller lots possible. Older single-family homes were replaced with townhomes. More people moved closer to jobs, services, and existing infrastructure without pushing the city farther out. What this revealed was important. Houston did not always need to grow outward to keep growing. Under the right conditions, it could grow inward, using land more efficiently and easing pressure on the edges. That idea points toward a different future. If design choices helped create sprawl, car dependence, and flooding, then different choices may be able to soften those problems. And that leads to the next section, what Houston is already doing and what it could still do to change direction. Instead of trying to force the city back into a single downtown, Houston has begun focusing on connection. The goal is no longer to erase the multiple skylines, but to stitch them together so they function as parts of one system. Projects along Main Street are filling the gap between downtown and the Texas Medical Center with mid-rise development, creating a continuous urban corridor rather than two isolated centers. This approach accepts the city as it is and works with it. Movement is being addressed in a similar way. While large rail expansions stalled, transit agencies shifted toward making buses faster and more reliable. Dedicated lanes and upgraded stops are turning key routes into direct links between major job centers, bypassing normal traffic. It's not flashy, it's practical, and it begins to solve the daily problem of moving between districts without relying entirely on cars. On the ground level, walkability is finally being treated as infrastructure. Streets like Montrose Boulevard are being redesigned with narrower lanes, wider sidewalks, and safer crossings. These changes slow traffic and make walking possible again on roads that once behaved like highways. At the same time, the city is revisiting policies that allowed sidewalks to disappear, redirecting funds toward building connected networks near schools and transit. Flooding and sprawl are also being addressed through green infrastructure. Bayous that once functioned only as drainage channels are now parks and trail systems that absorb water and allow people to move across the city without driving. These greenways are expanding into utility corridors, creating a second network that works alongside roads instead of competing with them. Even failed areas are being reused. Old malls and empty office sites are being targeted for redevelopment, allowing growth to move inward rather than farther out. None of this fixes Houston overnight, but it shows something important. The city is slowly beginning to repair itself. Houston was built on freedom and flexibility. Those choices allowed skylines to rise anywhere, spread the city outward, and shape how people lived and built for decades. What began as opportunity slowly turned into distance and a city split into pieces, and improvements are being made now. But here's the strange part. Houston is not the only city with a unique skyline. Los Angeles has one too, and for a very different reason. Why does one of the most famous cities in the world have the most confusing skyline ever? Click here to find out.